I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
Less than 4 minutes passed during the announcement. However, it permanently altered the monarchy. Inside, standing side by side, William and Catherine verified that King Charles had conveyed a sealed last desire at Windsor Castle. After learning heartbreaking information regarding the future king, in deteriorating health, talked firmly, but his wife's shaking hands revealed the suffering beneath the ceremony. This was not just another update from the palace. It was a sovereign's last order, a father's farewell, and the start of an ending that nobody was ready for. Prior to delving further into the implications of this, William gripped the sealed papers as the silence in the white drawing room grew. Royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Despite the absence of a senior royal, Catherine stayed by his side. Windsor Castle was significant since it was a family residence. The prince then read the fundamental decision out loud, making the statement both personal and constitutionally significant while working at the royal household. After learning that his illness had reached its last, irreversible stage, Charles activated a sealed declaration asking his oldest son to take up royal duties when needed and to ask the princess to keep the family cohesive during the change. An official written directive expressing the monarch's desires is called a royal declaration, and this one went beyond ritual. It readied the throne for a handover of power prior to frailty, uncertainty, or personal rivalry to seize power. When her father-in-law's recorded comments were read, Catherine lowered her gaze. According to the signed narrative, the king did not want to spend his last days arguing with people closest to him, engaging in public spectacle, or engaging in political negotiation. William hesitated, maintaining his composure, but his fingers clenched on the paper, as if each word the enigma grew, as the future king forced him to embrace a future he had spent his entire life fearing. He acknowledged the existence of a second sealed paper, but he would not divulge its entire contents, stating only that it worried those who needed to be reunited before the end. A number of royal household relatives were abruptly drawn into the shadow of a request that the audience was still unable to hear and comprehend. William eventually put the document down, but headed not leave, staring at Charles's scribbled signature until Catherine put her own hand over his clasped one. The declaration had not come after a calm family conversation. It was written after the monarch was persuaded by a private encounter that the institution could collapse the instant his strength waned. To comprehend why the father's last request became a directive, the family, who were already in mourning, needed to be taken care of first. 4 individuals dealing with 4 distinct types of loss were hidden behind the formal terminology. William was getting ready to inherit a crown, but yet clinging to her desire to be a son. Catherine was concealing her own sorrow while bearing her husband's. As Camilla watched the man who had shaped her adult life elude her, Charles, encircled by time, had ceased to obey him, and privilege was facing the one reality that no ruler could control. William stood by himself, reading his father's proclamation for the 3rd time in a Windsor hallway prior to the event. His gaze kept going back to one scrawled sentence: "Don't wait for me to weaken." The words required that he accept more than just permission. Duty before his grief took away his ability to take action. A royal declaration is a formal written directive that expresses the future monarch was forced to choose between 2 excruciating risks. Refusing it might disclose the crown when Charles is still alive, but accepting it could make him feel replaced. The most important thing was stability. Without saying anything, Catherine came in and carefully took the pages from her husband's trembling palm, telling him that carrying the king had urged her to take on the role of emotional center of the family, but her own load was equally enormous as his father's. She recognized the need to defend George, Charlotte, Louis, William, and family members already split by years of animosity, that it would be easier for the monarchy to endure a shift into power than it would be for the kids to endure witnessing their family fall apart. Camilla accepted her in a smaller sitting area. She carefully folded the sheet after reading the section that said, "No spouse should be in charge of succession decisions." The Queen Consort questioned the attendant if Charles had penned those lines prior to or following his conversation with his oldest Don. Her voice did not soar, according to a later recorded report from the assistant, and this constraint made the man she loved had put the institution's destiny out of her control, making her humiliation more intense. After midnight, Charles stayed up to read messages from his kids, and when William's name was said, the king closed his eyes, but declined to inquire as to whether the declaration had been approved since he was afraid of the response. Annie arrived before morning, sat across from her brother, and took his hand because either decision would hurt them both, and cautioned that his desire might preserve the throne while destroying the delicate part of the family. William read the second page, and the Princess Royal listened before asking the question she had been dreading respond, confirming that the most agonizing request was yet unspoken. It wasn't just Drake that had written that page. It was born on a particular night when love, loyalty, and the final wish did not start with a doctor's warning. Rather, it started 3 weeks prior, amid the collision of royal duty. A casual conversation about upcoming engagements turned into something far more serious during a private family supper at Clarence House. Increasingly perilous, voices hardened, old grievances came to the surface, and Charles saw his loved ones quarrel over his responsibilities. William then pushed back his chair, refusing to give up. Camilla covered a private schedule with her palm, and the monarch was aware that his family was already at odds about a future that none of them wanted to consider. Charles had convened the meeting to talk about how during his treatment, duties would be split, with Camilla sitting next to him and William, Catherine and Anne facing them over the table. Clarence House was more than just a royal mansion. It was the King's home in London, and the hub of the discussion was terribly personal since they were not strangers discussing policy. Rather, they were members of his private household, and family choosing who would take over his responsibilities in the event that his strength failed. Camilla was the first to speak, suggesting that even if Charles grew too feeble to evaluate every important decision, it should still go via the King's household. William heard more. The Queen Consort thought that continuity would preserve his dignity at hazardous. He cautioned that power without direct accountability would enable family members and aides to compete under his father's name, while no one acknowledged accountability for the outcomes. Catherine attempted to stabilize the discussion by reminding both parties. Camilla went to face the monarch, who was still there and listening, and inquired as to if the prince was discreetly getting ready to take over, or William pushed back his chair and replied that he would like to lose as the accusation hit home. The crown can then be paralyzed by covert control, thanks to public acceptance. It wasn't until Anne shifted her chair that anyone noticed Charles's hand shaking against the table as he set down his drink. Beside him, the Princess Royal asked everyone to go, but her brother refused because he needed to know the facts before making a decision. The king realized something harsh and indisputable as William defended direct responsibility. The family had left him with no safer option. Therefore, the son was already thinking like a sovereign. Charles called his private secretary after midnight. The declaration's opening lines were saved in a recorded dictation, and 2 sealed copies were ordered, one for William and another, to stay with the monarch's constitutional documents, which are safeguarded documents that include directives on royal power. The king then penned the second page himself. He refused to pass away when animosity governed the family, so he gave William and Catherine instructions to set up one last meeting with Camilla, Harry, and Anne. When he signed it, dawn had broken. Before the pen left the paper, Camilla had gone back to the hallway and heard enough to know the truth about Charles. Had put her out of the future chain of command, and when she was unable to ignore that exclusion, sadness became enraged, and Windsor would soon see the conflict he had been afraid of. Camilla did not call William as she called him in as the dying man's wife, a queen without any help, secretaries or prepared statements between them. She put Charles's proclamation on a table and asked if the future monarch had assisted. Write it. William said right away, no, but when she accused him of assuming authority while his father was, Camilla stood across from him in a private moment as the restraint that held them both together finally shattered. At his request, the doors of the Windsor sitting room were closed, and Catherine was waiting outside. The Queen Consort questioned whether Charles was still fully aware of the implications of his signature. A constitutional proclamation is a formal teaching pertaining to the management of royal responsibilities and power, and challenging the king's judgment endangered both his honor and the legitimacy of the change. William plainly understood the implication and cautioned her against turning his father's illness into the Queen struck the document with the backs of her fingers, turning it into a weapon against an uncontrollable decision. She insisted that Charles required consolation rather than a successor standing by constitutional documents, accusing the prince of assuming power too soon. William disclosed that he had first refused to even read the words since they touched the terror he had concealed from everyone. Proclamation. The only thing that altered him was a taped phone call. His father had gasped for air before uttering, "Don't allow my vulnerability to become the weakness of the country." Camilla's rage disintegrated. After spending years by the king's side, she sat down and acknowledged that he had ceased talking to her about the future. She now feared that the while she was still struggling to keep him there, the institution was quietly taking him away. William relented, but he did not back down. He informed her that now, in order to protect Charles, he had to follow his decision. Even though he was fully aware of it, Catherine didn't come in until she heard Camilla's voice break. After that decision hurt everyone in the room. The princess set a glass of water next to her and said nothing, and for a moment the three of them stood inside the same grief. But the mistrust persisted, unsolved, and Camilla eventually inquired as to if the second page directed her to William, said that she shouldn't leave her husband's side, and then he gave her the part she was afraid of, which required her to enter a before the finish. The Queen closed the declaration and consented to hear what Charles had planned to say in the room with Harry to attend. Prior to departing, she cautioned the prospective monarch that power might be transferred by signing unlocked pages, yet no one in this family would ever be asked to forgive. However, emotion was no longer the only factor influencing the result. The machinery of power had already started to move. The machinery of the kingdom had already started to turn as the family quarreled over love, loyalty, and treachery. Red boxes came before dawn, and constitutional advisors entered Windsor by a side door. Instructions were hidden between closed covers, but William, a very human person, was seated inside that process. For the first time, he stood at the head of his father's table, unable to touch the chair Charles usually occupied. William took a seat at the end of the table before the briefing started, but it didn't feel like a win responsibility. But he wouldn't act as though the succession had already taken place. The safe case used to carry official state documents to the monarch, and the fact that a few of them arrived before sunrise demonstrated why waiting had become risky. Signatures were still required for decisions. The nation could not stop, while a family found it difficult to absorb what was about to happen. Government business still needed answers. Catherine observed from the doorway, then walking next to him, she saw Charles's fountain pen sitting next to the unaltered briefing folder. Advisors clarified that the proclamation just increased the prince's authority over the state. It did not declare him king. Senior household decisions, urgent approvals, and briefings. When his father was too weak to take action, the king would maintain his dignity and legal standing, but the work that was done around him could no longer rely only on his health. Annie came in with a warning. She was in favor of the transfer, but insisted on formal protections for Camilla, and the Princess Royal recognized the risk and insisted that Charles be kept updated whenever his health permitted. Clearly without boundaries, William's team, the Queen's office, and the King's household may become rivals, donors of power, each functioning on behalf of the King. Mistrust grew behind closed doors, but William wouldn't agree unless another condition was added. His father had to be personally informed of every significant choice, even if the King was no longer able to approve it, would be in charge. But a private secretary would never treat Charles as if he had already vanished. Subsequently exposed the harshest reality. The second page was a personal request rather than a constitutional document. Legal order, which meant that no royal agency, court, or counselor could force someone to follow it. Forgiveness must be selected. Following the briefing, Catherine discovered her husband by himself, gazing over his first signed directive. She responded that Charles had not asked him to, and William acknowledged that although the signature appeared to be his own, it felt like a betrayal of his father. He had asked his son to prevent dread from turning into chaos by imitating the king. Then confirmation came, and Harry had consented. Return would go without advisors. The changeover machinery was in motion, but its initial wounds would not show up on official documents. Instead, they would show up in hallways, bedrooms, and the faces of those observing their former life vanishes. There were no public ceremonies or trumpets when the first repercussions occurred. Charles's daily red boxes were suddenly. William's name showed up above choices that had previously only been made by the king. Rooms were redistributed, engagements were cancelled, and employees were told to get ready for a transition, but nobody was allowed to make an impending call. Charles then noticed the updated schedule on his nightstand, read it once, took off his glasses, and before anyone could see his response, he instructed the assistant to go. Charles observed his official life is reduced to secret briefings, important audiences, and carefully selected family gatherings. William now carried almost all external obligations. An audience is a formal gathering that the monarch grants, and decreasing those gatherings, each cancellation was significant since it was one of the most obvious indications that the king was still active. Safeguarded his strength, but each void in the schedule also heightened the sense of impending loss. When debating an urgent directive, a long-serving courtier made the error that everyone feared. He referred to William's approval as the King's Charles, heard the comments coming from the room next door, and the assistant stopped, expecting a reprimand or an outburst. Rather, the king stood up, walked the short distance, and shut the door himself. His silent action spoke more. Camilla called off her own engagement because the family was already learning how to live without him, and would not let the public mistake her devotion. Therefore, Charles begged her to stay by his side. While he was still alive, the queen consort knelt next to him at a funeral vigil and gave his wedding ring back to his hand after it fell from his shrinking finger, and she didn't lean against the wall until she got to the hallway and weep silently. William signed the approval after receiving his first urgent state file under the new system, then promised that no significant decision would be made without first calling his father and reading every word out loud. When Charles heard it, the future king sat by himself and eventually broke down. The monarch listened silently and then said, "That was the correct decision." Moments later, Catherine found him, and instead of pretending to console him, she knelt next to his chair and told him the truth. Even though the loss had not yet occurred, grief had already started. William grasped her hand, but neither of them claimed to be in anguish. May be resolved. Anne set up the space for the meeting that was requested on the second page, removing employees, phones, and certified note-takers, since no organization could mend the rift between them. Harry went through a private royal door and halted when he inquired if Charles was aware of his arrival, after noticing his father's shortened itinerary on an assistant's clipboard. No office, declaration, or etiquette would stand for the first time when Princess Royal answered the door and said, "He has been waiting for you." There were no titles or uniforms in the room, just a father and the family he feared leaving shattered. Charles was seated next to the fireplace, with Camilla on one side, William and Catherine across from him, and Anne next to the door, and Harry stood hesitantly behind the last vacant chair. The king appeared to be smaller than all of them. He had not called them together to talk about succession. Rather, he had called them together because he refused to let the wrath that his family had never had the guts to put an end to was passed down to the monarchy. Charles invited his younger son to take a seat before explaining why the second page had been drafted. According to him, constitutional stability meant maintaining the crown's authority in times of weakness or change, but no formal if they left the room more divided than before. Every signature he made may save a family determined to carry on long-standing animosity had created would be pointless. The king turned to William first, acknowledging that he had given him too much responsibility. The future king was equally honest in his response, saying that he had little of the assurance a son required from his father. Spent years getting ready to take the throne, while privately thinking that being ready was an act of treachery. Charles grabbed his hand from across the table and explained that accepting the future was not the same. As William bowed his head, but he did not retreat. The king turned to face Harry, admitted that neither man could erase the public wounds, the distance, or the rage. A detailed account was made. Following the recording of the discussion, Charles did not demand immediate pardon or offer an explanation for previous behavior. Instead, he merely stated that he did not want his last recollection of his younger son to remain unanswered. Harry hesitated before acknowledging that he had come back because he thought the proclamation was an order rather than, and the Duke eventually sat down, and Camilla was asked to accept the offer, to which Charles softly replied that it was a father's request, that William had to oversee the changeover without intervention. She accepted, but she insisted on one condition: she would stay. The prince promised that no decision would take her away from her role as her husband's wife, and not turn her into a symbol controlled by the organization. Catherine acted as a mediator between them, preventing Charles from turning their remaining time into a constitutional issue. When he was unable to do so, The king urged her to maintain contact. She agreed, but cautioned that reconciliation needed real boundaries, not just appearances. When Anne noticed her brother's strength waning, she took action to put an end to themating. She was interrupted by Charles, who urged everyone to stay for a single private supper without any staff or duty discussions. Then Harry shifted his seat next to William. Neither brother said anything because they didn't need to. The first portion of the family had transformed by the time the doors reopened, and the father's last wish had already been granted. Outside, people were starting to realize what William and Catherine had actually verified. The response did not start with yelling, but rather with quiet. Broadcast disrupted people's routines all around Britain and placed William's declaration in the middle of the screen. Strangers congregated outside Buckingham Palace, without being called, bearing flowers, but unsure if daylight had really arrived. Then, one newspaper published its initial edition. 5 phrases that encapsulated the spirit of the country were written beneath a black and white image of Charles. By daybreak, the world had access to the monarchy's private grief, and broadcasters called the king's farewell announcement the most obvious indication to date that the reign was coming to an end. They concentrated on Charles's appeal for family harmony and his increasing responsibility. The palace only issued a brief statement, verifying the king's continued sovereignty and receipt of crucial information. Sovereign refers to the ruling king, who is the legitimate head of state. This distinction was important because the nation was emotionally getting ready for change before any official succession had occurred. Hundreds of people gathered outside Buckingham Palace as the rain continued to fall. A small child approached the gates with a handmade message and set it next to the flats. It said,
"Thank you for staying brave."
It was a simple statement that was more powerful than the loudest speech. They were reacting to a farewell that had started prior to the last goodbye. They were grieving a death. The Crown Chronicle published its top page with a tiny image of Charles by himself beneath the headline, "A King Prepares His Goodbye," shown William and Catherine holding hands following their declaration. A national broadcaster played back the scene where she supported her husband and said the public sympathy for Camilla also changed once the second royal duty gave way to obvious human sorrow. Confirmation that she had been asked to stay by Charles's side. Harry's return continued to spark controversy, but the palace withheld information about the private family gathering. Reconciliation was shielded from becoming yet another public conflict by the quiet. When an assistant suggested unleashing a meticulously planned family, Anne promptly rejected one idea.image. The Princess Royal responded that her brother had requested tranquility rather than a performance, and her rejection halted. William made a fleeting appearance to recognize the waiting crowd. But he did not wave, preventing the palace from converting a private breakthrough into staged proof. Expecting applause, Catherine joined the future king as he lowered his head and covered his heart with one hand. William later went back to Charles and told him about the flowers, the boy's card, and the still throng. The stillness evolved into an act of respect. With a little smirk, the king inquired as to whether the country had appeared terrified. "No," his son answered. "They looked grateful." The public had responded to Charles, but the ultimate decision, would Charles's final wish, was formed out of tragedy. But it did not end in despair. It came from what his family decided to do with the peace he had forced them to face. It made a wife give up control without giving up love, a son accept the weight he feared, and 2 brothers to sit next to each other once more, and a future queen to serve as a link between family and duty could not halt time or take away sadnesses. But before the end came, it gave the king something that power had never assured him of: peace. William formally acknowledged the additional duties his father had given him, but there was no sign of victory in the first private lesson. Charles's name would remain on all official documents for as long as the monarch remained capable of serving. Increased royal power meant assuming more of the monarch's operational responsibilities without his replacement, and that distinction significantly. The future king desired both the protection of the nation and the preservation of his father's honor to the very end. In order to provide Camilla, Anne, Harry, and William with direct familial communication, Catherine's same updates simultaneously. The princess realized that the family had already been poisoned by silence. Camilla also fulfilled her promise that information would stop mistrust from developing in the voids between them. She read letters aloud, stayed by Charles's side, avoided making decisions about succession, and protected his private hours from demands that no longer warranted his power. Harry avoided public appearances for a few days before departing Fother's room with himself and came out shocked but more composed. The Duke made no declaration, no interview, and his quiet conveyed a message of its own. Some scars had not healed, yet they had been confronted at last without cameras or resentment separating them. Anne saved the scribbled second page in the Princess Royal, also prepared Charles's private archive, a safeguarded collection of the monarch's private documents copies for Harry, William, Catherine, and Camilla so that none of them could subsequently dispute what he had asked them to recall. Then William took George, Charlotte, and Louis to their grandfather. Charles made no mention of succession or titles. He explained to the kids that the crown was important only when it kept people safe rather than dividing them. Left. The monarch turned to his oldest son and declared that the last desire had already been granted. The family had gone inside. They had left the room understanding what needed to change. Later, William signed a letter praising the palace workers for their loyalty using his father's fountain pen. He hesitated, then put it back on Charles's desk. The tragedy persisted as Catherine closed the proclamation and set it next to the family photos. Love could not ease the suffering that awaited Charles as he approached the end of his life. But his final act of authority had freed his family from silence, strife, and dread, but it had not shielded a throne. William left the end with Catherine by his side. Feeling no triumph, he left as a son, ready to uphold the principles his father had selected for his last inheritance. In addition to preparing Britain for a new era, King Charles's final request brought a fractured family home. Thank you for viewing. Please remember to subscribe and like, and we'll see you in the next one.